The world had ended, but no one knew exactly when. Some marked it as the day the news anchors stopped speaking of hope and started speaking of evacuations. Others said it was the day the first wave of the undead appeared on the streets, barely distinguishable from the wreckage of civilization. But for Emma Carter, it was the moment her husband, Peter, stopped answering the phone calls, and the phone went silent for good. Now, weeks later, Emma, along with a small group of survivors, made their way through the outskirts of a decimated city. Buildings, once filled with life, were now hollowed husks of concrete and rust, windows shattered, doors left ajar as if inviting them to come inside. Zombies wandered through the streets, dragging their broken limbs like marionettes with lost strings. They had no eyes, no minds, just hunger. Emma wasn't afraid of them. She was used to it by now, and besides, she had learned to avoid them with the precision of a hunter. What she wasn't prepared for was the suspicion that gnawed at her heart. "Keep moving," said Nathan, the leader of the group. He was strong, resourceful, and the only one who seemed to maintain any semblance of hope in their daily struggle. But Emma had started to notice something unsettling about Nathan's leadership. He seemed too controlling, too ready to take charge when decisions were being made. Something about him felt different now, more distant. Behind them, the group trailed quietly, the others lost in their own thoughts. There was Sarah, the former nurse who had become their makeshift medic. The group had grown fond of her, but there were whispers about her strange behaviors at night. Her eyes would flutter with paranoia, as if someone, or something, was watching them. Then there was Marcus, the quiet mechanic who kept to himself. He used to talk about a family he was trying to find, but Emma hadn't heard him mention them in days. It was as if the weight of the world had crushed his voice. And lastly, there was Jack. Jack had once been a college student, smart, idealistic, full of dreams. But as the days dragged on, his optimism had started to deteriorate. Emma saw it in his eyes, the defeat, the hopelessness that crept in like a shadow, slowly swallowing the light he had once carried. They entered a warehouse, one of the few buildings that hadn't been completely overrun. The windows were boarded up, and the air inside was thick with the smell of stale food and mildew. This would be their shelter for the night. Emma set her pack down on the cold concrete floor, rubbing her tired eyes. "We should check the perimeter," she suggested, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. Nathan nodded but hesitated for a moment. "I'll take the first watch tonight," he said, his voice low, authoritative. Emma raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Fine. Just be careful." As the others settled into their makeshift camp, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air in the warehouse was too still, the silence too deafening. The once comfortable camaraderie between them had dissolved, replaced by a tension Emma couldn't place. Was it the zombies, or was it something darker, something inside the group itself? She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her mind kept returning to the unspoken words, the looks exchanged in the shadows, the odd way Sarah flinched whenever someone touched her. Emma tried to shake it off, but the feeling of betrayal hung heavy in her chest. There was something within this group, something that could turn them into monsters far worse than the ones roaming outside. And if she didn't figure it out soon, she feared the real apocalypse wouldn't come from the undead, it would come from the people she had to trust with her life. The cold night air was oppressive inside the warehouse. The distant moans of the undead echoed faintly outside, muffled by the thick walls, but the group knew the danger was never far. They had fortified the entrance as best they could, barrels, crates, and whatever else they could find had been dragged into place, but Emma knew it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. She tried to sleep, lying on her back with her arms folded over her chest, but her mind kept replaying the events of the day. Nathan's behavior, his insistence on taking the lead, the way he spoke to Marcus with a firmness that bordered on condescension, and the coldness he had shown when Jack had suggested they move east to search for other survivors. There was a bite to Nathan's words that didn't belong in the voice of someone who wanted to protect them. Emma couldn't understand it. They had all been through the same horrors, witnessed the same atrocities. What had changed? Was Nathan hiding something? Or worse, was he becoming like the monsters they feared? She sighed, rubbing her temples. No. It wasn't just Nathan. There was something wrong with all of them. In the corner of the room, Sarah whispered something in a voice too quiet for Emma to hear. Emma watched as Sarah glanced over her shoulder at Nathan, her eyes wide with panic. She wasn't as good at hiding her fear anymore, and Emma couldn't ignore the way Sarah flinched when anyone got too close. Emma's suspicions grew. She couldn't place it, but something about Sarah seemed off. It wasn't just the fear, it was the sense that Sarah was hiding something. The way she avoided eye contact, the way her hands trembled whenever she handled supplies. Emma had seen it in people before, in the broken, scared eyes of survivors who had done things they regretted. Things they couldn't undo. The sound of footsteps interrupted Emma's thoughts. Nathan was approaching, his boots echoing sharply against the concrete floor. His dark silhouette appeared in the dim light, casting a long shadow across the room. He stopped in front of her and crouched down, his face unreadable. "You awake?" Nathan asked, his voice soft but firm, like a man accustomed to being obeyed. Emma nodded, trying to appear calm. "Can't sleep." "You should. We'll need to be ready in the morning." Emma swallowed, unsure of what to say. There was something in Nathan's eyes, a calculating look that made her skin crawl. She had once trusted him, hell, she had relied on him, but now, she wasn't so sure. "I've been thinking," she started, her voice low, "maybe we should talk about moving to a safer place. Somewhere less exposed." Nathan's expression didn't change. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he spoke, his tone even, but there was an edge to it. "We're fine here, Emma. No one's going to find us in the city. The last thing we need is to draw attention." Emma's heart raced. "But Nathan, what about Sarah? What about Marcus? They don't look well. We can't just stay here if..." "Enough." Nathan's voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. "We stay here. And we do what I say. Understand?" The sudden surge of authority in his voice sent a chill down Emma's spine. Her stomach twisted, but she nodded silently. What could she say? Nathan was the leader. He made the decisions, and if anyone spoke out against him, they were branded a threat to the group's survival. She knew the rules. She just didn't like the way they were being enforced. But deep down, something inside her told her Nathan wasn't telling the truth. That was the thing about people in a crisis, they could lie with a smile, they could hide their fear behind bravado, but sometimes the truth seeped out through the cracks. Nathan was hiding something, and Emma was beginning to think she wasn't the only one. As Nathan moved back to his position near the entrance, Emma's eyes flickered to Sarah, who was sitting by herself, her back to the wall, staring off into space. The fear in Sarah's eyes wasn't the kind caused by the zombies outside. It was the kind caused by something much more dangerous, the threat that came from within. Emma's suspicions deepened. The group was unraveling, and the true monsters weren't outside in the darkness. They were right here, in the very walls that protected them from the undead. It wasn't just survival that they were fighting for now, it was control. And Emma wasn't sure how much longer she could trust any of them. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting thin shafts of light across the darkened warehouse. Emma stood by the door, watching as the others slowly stirred, their faces haggard and hollow with exhaustion. The air was thick with tension, and Emma could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were all waiting for something to snap, something inside them, something that had already begun to unravel. Nathan was already up, standing near the door with his arms crossed, surveying the perimeter with sharp, calculating eyes. He was always the first to rise, always the first to take charge. But lately, his behavior had been more erratic, more possessive. Emma could see it in the way he looked at the others, like they were pieces on a chessboard, expendable when the time came. "Emma," Nathan called, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "You're up." "Good." Emma didn't respond immediately, her mind still racing. She'd spent the entire night trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. They were all on edge, but it wasn't just the zombies. It was something else, a darker force, eating away at them from the inside. She met his gaze, swallowing the unease that twisted in her stomach. "What's the plan for today?" Nathan straightened, his face hardening. "We head out and scavenge. We need more supplies if we're going to last another week. I'll take Marcus and Jack, and you stay here with Sarah." Emma's heart skipped. "Sarah," she echoed, trying to mask the disbelief in her voice. "You want me to stay with her?" Nathan didn't meet her eyes. "She's not well. I don't want her going out there. You're the only one who can keep an eye on her." The words felt like a slap. The way Nathan spoke, as though Sarah's condition was something to be controlled rather than understood. Emma didn't trust it. She didn't trust any of this anymore. But there was no point in arguing. The others had already started to gather their things, and it was clear that Nathan's word was law now. Emma glanced over at Sarah, who was sitting in the corner, her head bowed, hands trembling. She looked fragile, like she might break at any moment. But Emma knew there was more to Sarah than met the eye. Everyone had secrets in this new world, Emma's own were buried deep. "We'll be fine," Nathan said, his voice almost too calm. "Just make sure Sarah doesn't try anything stupid." Emma nodded slowly, the unease in her chest tightening. She watched as Nathan, Marcus, and Jack left the warehouse, disappearing into the streets outside, their silhouettes swallowed up by the fog of the city. Emma turned back to Sarah, who had not moved from her spot. "Sarah," Emma said quietly, crossing the room to sit beside her. "Are you okay?" For a long moment, Sarah didn't answer. Her eyes were blank, unfocused, but Emma could see the flicker of something behind them, a kind of sharp awareness that hadn't been there before. "I'm fine," Sarah muttered, her voice distant. "Just tired." Emma studied her for a moment, then sighed. "Sarah, you're not fine. Something's going on. What aren't you telling me?" Sarah flinched, her body stiffening as if Emma had struck her. She looked up, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie to me," Emma said gently but firmly. "We're in this together. I need to know the truth." For a moment, it seemed as though Sarah might break. Her shoulders trembled, and her lips parted as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Then, in a barely audible whisper, she said, "It's Nathan. He's not who you think he is." Emma froze. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mind raced. "What do you mean?" "I saw him," Sarah continued, her voice shaking. "I saw him, with the others. Before they left." Emma frowned. "What others?" "The people who aren't like us," Sarah said, her voice quivering. "He's been making deals with them. Trading us, for something." Emma's blood ran cold. "What kind of deals?" "I don't know," Sarah whispered. "But it's bad, Emma. He's been hiding things, he's been hiding us from them, too." The words hit Emma like a punch to the gut. Her mind raced, trying to process everything Sarah had just said. Nathan, their leader, had been making deals with others. And from the way Sarah spoke, these others weren't survivors like them. They were something else, something darker. Emma stood up quickly, her hands trembling. She had to get to Nathan. She had to confront him before it was too late. But as she moved toward the door, Sarah grabbed her arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't," she pleaded. "If you go after him now, it'll be too late. He's already made his choices." Emma stared at Sarah, torn between the desperate need to confront Nathan and the nagging feeling that Sarah might be right. Was Nathan truly hiding something worse than the undead outside? Or was Sarah's fear clouding her judgment? One thing was certain, Emma's trust in the group was shattered. The real monsters were not the ones stumbling through the streets. They were the ones she called her companions. And it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. The tension between Emma and Sarah was palpable as they stood in the dimly lit warehouse. Emma's mind was spinning, each thought battling the next. Sarah had said things she couldn't ignore. Nathan had been making deals with others, others who weren't like them, others who might have their own agenda. The weight of that revelation settled like a stone in Emma's chest, suffocating her with the impossible choices it presented. For a long moment, Emma stared at Sarah, who was still holding her arm with a grip that was both pleading and desperate. Sarah's eyes were wide, unblinking, but there was something else there, fear, yes, but also a glimmer of something darker, something that seemed to understand the gravity of what was happening. "Sarah," Emma began, her voice faltering. "What do you mean by others? Who are they?" Sarah's lips trembled, but she didn't respond immediately. Her eyes flicked toward the door, as if expecting someone to appear. It was clear that Sarah was terrified of Nathan, terrified of these mysterious others, and maybe even terrified of the consequences of speaking the truth. "They're not people like us," Sarah finally whispered, voice barely audible. "They're not survivors. They're different. They've been following us for days now. I've seen them out there, watching." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "How do you know this?" Sarah hesitated, glancing toward the door again. "I saw one of them last night. I couldn't sleep, so I went to check the perimeter. I saw someone who wasn't like the others. They didn't move like a human. They weren't alive." Emma's stomach churned. "You saw a zombie?" Sarah shook her head quickly. "No, not a zombie. Something worse." Emma's mind raced. What could be worse than the Walking Dead? She had seen the horrors of this world, the undead that could tear a person apart without hesitation, the brutalities that humans were capable of under the strain of survival. But something worse? That was a thought Emma couldn't quite comprehend. "Are you sure?" Emma asked. "Because if you saw a person, it could just be someone who got infected. A survivor who's turned." "No, Emma," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "It wasn't like that. This person, this thing, it was different. It moved in jerks, like it was being controlled. I couldn't even see its face clearly. But I could feel its eyes on me. It's not just zombies out there. There are things waiting, and Nathan's been trading with them." Emma's breath caught in her throat. The idea that Nathan was involved in something beyond their comprehension, something darker, was beginning to make sense in a way she wished it didn't. She had known Nathan to be calculating, to make decisions that kept them alive, but this was beyond survival. This was something else entirely. "I have to find out the truth," Emma said, her voice steel. She yanked her arm from Sarah's grasp, the decision hardening in her chest. "I'm going after Nathan." "No, Emma." Sarah's voice was panicked, her eyes wide with genuine fear. "You don't understand. If you go after him, he'll do something to you. You don't know what he's capable of." But Emma couldn't listen anymore. She had to know. She couldn't live with the uncertainty gnawing at her every waking moment. If Nathan had betrayed them, if he was truly involved in something worse than the undead, then she couldn't let him lead them any longer. Emma moved swiftly toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Sarah called after her, but she didn't stop. She had to confront Nathan, she had to find out for herself what was happening before it was too late. Outside, the morning light was dim and gray, the fog thickening as it rolled through the broken streets. The city was eerily quiet, save for the distant groans of zombies and the occasional screech of metal against stone. Emma moved quickly, staying in the shadows, her senses heightened as she approached the place where Nathan, Marcus, and Jack had gone. She knew it wasn't safe to move too far from the warehouse, but she had no choice. She couldn't ignore Sarah's warning, she needed to know. As she rounded a corner, she spotted the group ahead of her. Nathan was leading the way, his back straight, his movements purposeful. Marcus and Jack flanked him, but they were quieter than usual, more subdued. Emma's gaze locked onto Nathan, her heart racing. This was it. She was close. She crouched behind a wrecked car, her breath shallow, as she watched them. Nathan paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the area, and Emma felt a chill creep down her spine. Something about the way he moved, it was calculated, as if he knew exactly where to look. As if he were expecting her. Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. "We need to get back. Now." Emma's heart skipped. It was Nathan. Without thinking, she pushed herself to her feet and moved toward the group. She needed to confront him, needed to know what he was hiding. But as she stepped out from her hiding place, she froze. Standing next to Nathan was a figure, tall, cloaked, its face obscured by shadows. And in the figure's hands, Emma saw something that made her stomach lurch, a piece of equipment, a device that looked too advanced for the world they were living in. The figure spoke, its voice cold and detached. "We have a deal. No turning back now." Emma's mind raced. What was happening? Who were these people? And what had Nathan gotten them involved in? Before she could take another step, Nathan's voice rang out, sharp and filled with an authority Emma had never heard before. "Emma, you shouldn't have followed us." Emma froze, her eyes locked on Nathan as the figure beside him stepped forward, its cloak billowing in the wind. Her pulse raced in her ears, the gravity of the situation crashing down on her like a freight train. The device in the stranger's hand glinted ominously in the pale daylight, something out of place in a world that had long since lost any semblance of order. Nathan's cold eyes swept over her, his jaw clenched, his posture rigid. "I told you to stay back." Emma's throat constricted, but she refused to show any fear. She couldn't. Not now. Not after everything she'd learned. The truth was staring her in the face, and there was no going back. "What's going on, Nathan?" Her voice trembled, but she kept it steady. "Who is this? And what the hell are you doing with that thing?" Nathan's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Emma saw something in him, a flicker of something she hadn't noticed before. It was guilt, yes, but something colder beneath it. Something dangerous. "You shouldn't have seen this," Nathan said, his voice low and sharp. "This doesn't concern you." "I'm not leaving until I understand," Emma shot back, stepping closer, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife she had tucked into her belt. It wasn't much, but it was something. "What are you doing, Nathan?" The cloaked figure beside Nathan shifted, its face still hidden in the shadows, and Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The thing, wasn't human. Not entirely. There was something off about the way it stood, its movements too fluid, its presence too unnatural. Her instincts screamed at her, a primal warning that the danger in front of her was far greater than anything she had imagined. Nathan took a step forward, blocking her path. "We had a deal, Emma. You don't get to ask questions anymore." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. "A deal? With them?" She gestured toward the cloaked figure, her words catching in her throat. "What are they?" Nathan's jaw clenched as he glanced over his shoulder, his eyes flashing with frustration. "They're survivors, just like us. Or they were, until they found a better way to survive." Emma shook her head. This isn't survival. You're making deals with monsters." The figure's head tilted slightly, its shadowed face moving just enough to reveal a glint of eyes, shiny and unnatural, like polished obsidian. Emma's blood ran cold. These were no survivors. This was something else. "I told you to stay away, Emma," Nathan repeated, but there was a desperation in his voice now. It was a crack she hadn't heard before. It was as if he were trying to justify his actions, to convince himself as much as her. "Why?" Emma demanded. "Why are you doing this? What are you trading for? What's so important that you'd risk everything, your life, our lives, for it?" Nathan's eyes flickered toward the figure, his expression darkening. "We don't have time for this. It's too late." Emma's heart dropped into her stomach. "What do you mean, it's too late?" The figure stepped forward, its presence unnerving. "The deal is done. You're already part of it." Nathan's expression twisted with something that resembled regret, but there was no turning back now. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small metal object, a transmitter of some kind, and held it up for Emma to see. It was sleek, high-tech, and out of place in a world where survival was about scavenging for scraps. "What is that?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. This is what we've been working for, Nathan said, his voice strained. This is our way out. A way to survive. Emma's confusion deepened. Survive? What are you talking about? Nathan glanced at the cloaked figure again. The figure raised its head slightly, and Emma could see now that its features were distorted, its skin stretched unnaturally tight over its bones. It wasn't human, not in the way she understood. But there was intelligence in those eyes, something calculated, something that made Emma's skin crawl. Nathan's voice dropped to a whisper, as if revealing the truth would be the final step in a descent into madness. They're offering us protection. They can help us rebuild. Help us rebuild? Emma's voice broke. This is madness. You're making deals with monsters for what? Power? Control? The figure chuckled, an unsettling sound, hollow and mechanical. Power? Control? No. We're offering you something much more precious, life. Emma shook her head in disbelief. You can't be serious. You think this is the way forward? Trading our humanity for survival? Nathan's expression hardened. Do you think we have a choice anymore, Emma? You think we can survive just by hiding and running? The world isn't the same. These are the new rules. We are the ones who adapt, or we die. The words hit Emma like a slap, but she wasn't ready to give up just yet. She couldn't accept this, couldn't let Nathan drag them all into something worse than the zombies that lurked outside. The cloaked figure stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The choice has already been made, it said, its voice a strange, guttural mix of human and something else entirely. Nathan understands. He's accepted the terms. Now, you must accept it too. I don't accept anything, Emma spat, her voice full of defiance. You'll never control me. But the figure reached out, its hand unnervingly swift, and before Emma could react, it pressed something against her neck, a cold, metallic touch that made her body tense, as if some invisible pressure were bearing down on her chest. Too late, the figure whispered. You're already marked. Emma gasped, feeling a sharp sting in her neck, like a needle piercing her skin. She reached up instinctively, but her vision blurred, and her limbs grew heavy. The last thing she saw before her knees buckled beneath her was Nathan's expression, dark, resigned, and empty. And as the world around her faded to black, Emma understood. The real monsters weren't the ones walking through the streets. They were the ones pulling the strings from the shadows, making deals with the very forces of destruction that had torn apart everything she once knew. And now, there was no way out. Emma's head was spinning, the world around her drifting in and out of focus as the coldness seeped into her body. She could feel herself slipping, the world tilting as if she were trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't escape. Her thoughts were hazy, like fog rolling over her mind, but there was one thing she knew with crystal clarity: the choice had been taken from her. She had been marked. The pressure on her neck lifted, and she staggered to her feet, clutching at her head as if trying to hold on to whatever was left of her sanity. But the numbness in her limbs persisted, the world around her now distorted, like a half-forgotten dream. The cloaked figure was still standing there, watching her with its dark, emotionless eyes. Nathan, too, was close, but his expression had changed. Gone was the leader who had protected them all. Gone was the man who had fought to keep them alive. What stood before her now was a man who had made a deal with the very things that had torn their world apart. Nathan, Emma rasped, struggling to focus. Why? His eyes flickered with a mixture of regret and cold resolve. He looked at her as though she were already lost to him. It's too late, Emma. The deal is done. I did what I had to do to keep us alive. Emma's chest tightened. You think this is living? Her voice cracked. You think any of this is survival? This is death. Nathan's face hardened. You don't understand. They're giving us a future. A chance to rebuild. They have technology, things we can't even begin to imagine. This world is dead, Emma. We're not going to survive out there without them. And you're willing to sell us out for that? Emma's words were filled with disgust. For the scraps they're offering? For their future? The cloaked figure stepped forward again, its movements almost too smooth, too calculated. You've already seen the consequences of not accepting our offer, Emma. The truth is, there is no longer a place for people like you, people who can't see the bigger picture. Nathan has made the right choice. The rest of you will have to, too. Emma's eyes burned with fury, her pulse racing. You're lying. All of you. You're using us. What is it you really want, huh? What's your endgame? The figure didn't answer immediately. It simply reached out a hand, and suddenly, Emma felt an electric jolt pulse through her body, a sensation that caused her to freeze in place. It wasn't pain, but something far worse, an unnatural connection, like her mind was being tethered to something cold and inhuman. She wanted to scream, to fight it, but the pull was too strong. And then she saw it, visions, distorted fragments of images flashing before her eyes. Her thoughts twisted, and she saw herself, but not as she was now. She was part of something larger, part of the web of influence that stretched out before her, something vast and all-consuming. The zombies she had fought so hard to survive against? They were nothing but a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The truth hit her with a sickening clarity. These things, these others, weren't just survivors. They were something else. Something that had long since transcended human limitations, playing the game of survival on a far more terrifying scale. Nathan's voice broke through her disorienting thoughts. We've been given the keys to what's left. This is the only way to ensure we live, we survive. And you're going to be a part of it. Emma's breath hitched. I'd rather die than become a puppet. Nathan's expression faltered for a split second, the faintest trace of guilt crossing his features. But it was gone just as quickly. I gave you a chance, he said, his voice flat. I did try to protect you. Protect me? Emma spat, her hands shaking with rage. You've already condemned us all. You betrayed us. I didn't have a choice, Nathan said, his words devoid of emotion now. The world doesn't work the way you think it does. It never did. And I'm trying to make sure we're the ones who come out on top. Emma's mind swirled, but in that moment, she realized something. Nathan wasn't the man she once knew. He had already given up, lost in the cold promise of survival that these creatures offered. He'd sold his soul, and now, his humanity was gone. The cloaked figure reached forward once again, extending a hand toward Emma, but this time, something in her snapped. The icy numbness, the despair, the betrayal, it all fueled a fire deep within her. She had nothing left to lose. If this was the end, she would go down fighting. She lurched forward, her hands finding the knife she had hidden in her belt. With a surge of strength, she slashed at the figure's outstretched arm, the blade cutting through the air. The figure recoiled with a hiss, but its movement was too quick. It grabbed Emma's wrist, twisting it with unnatural force, and the knife fell from her hand. Nathan's eyes darkened as he stepped back, his voice cold. This is your choice, Emma. You can't escape. But Emma wasn't done. She kicked out with her foot, landing a blow to the cloaked figure's chest, and in that split second, she saw it, a glimpse of what the figure really was. Its skin was cracked, like brittle porcelain, and beneath it, something ancient and malicious shifted, moving as if it were a puppet on strings. A shudder ran through Emma's body. She couldn't let them win. With all the strength she had left, Emma wrenched her arm free and stumbled backward, gasping for breath. Her vision blurred, but she could still see clearly enough to make out Nathan's expression, a mixture of anger and something else, fear, perhaps. The fear that he had already lost everything. This isn't over, she spat, her words sharp and defiant. The figure stepped forward once more, but before it could reach her, a low, guttural roar echoed through the street. The sound of something alive, something angry, tearing through the darkness. Emma's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone anymore. Nathan's face went pale. It's too late. Before he could finish his sentence, the zombies appeared, stumbling out of the mist, their groans filling the air, and behind them, something larger, something more terrifying than any of them had seen before. The figure stepped back, and for a brief moment, Nathan seemed to hesitate. Emma didn't wait. She turned and ran, knowing that survival wasn't just about choosing sides, it was about finding a way to fight, even when it seemed like there was no hope left.